In the quiet of a dawn-lit runway where shadows cling to secrets long buried, Jenna Rhodess stretches alone, her weathered hands brushing the concrete as if reaching for a past no one remembers. Beneath her shirt, a tattoo, etched in ink and pain, whispers of a mission so classified it was erased from history. Mocked by young trainees, dismissed as a relic, she carries scars that tell a story of sacrifice and survival. But when a fleeting glimpse of those inked symbols stops a general in his tracks, the laughter fades, and a truth too dangerous to stay hidden begins to unravel. This is not just a tale of codes and conspiracies. It's the heartbeat of a woman who refused to vanish, fighting to protect those who will inherit the battles she's already won. Step into Jenna's world, where courage is carved in silence, and every scar holds a story that demands to be heard. Nice stretch, Grandma. Trying to relive your glory days? The mocking voice drifted across the tarmac, casual and cruel. They chuckled as she bent forward near the runway, lifting just enough to reveal a glimpse of dark ink etched along her side, symbols that curled upward beneath her ribs like a secret only the past could read. But then everything changed. In an instant, the laughter stopped. A clipboard slipped from the hands of a passing general and clattered against the concrete. His eyes widened, frozen mid-step. Within seconds, the base's casual hum turned electric. Phones were confiscated, orders shouted, a lockdown declared. Because the ink wasn't just decoration. It wasn't rebellion or vanity. It was a blacklisted code, one so buried in military archives it had no digital footprint, no official operation name, no survivors on record. That tattoo, wrapped in jagged symbols, was a forgotten rescue marker from a mission erased 15 years ago. She wasn't just a simulation trainer. She was living evidence of something the military had buried deep, a ghost from a classified past resurfacing in plain daylight. And her return wasn't just inconvenient. It was explosive. The sun hadn't broken over the horizon yet, but the airstrip was already stirring. Under the blue-tinged dawn, Jenna Rhodess stood alone at the edge of the tarmac. Her figure, lean, measured, immovable, cut against the spreading light like it belonged to another era. She was 44 now, and every movement she made radiated the kind of control only discipline, lifelong, unflinching discipline, could create. Each stretch, each breath was deliberate. There was no waste, no hesitation. She wore a slim-fitting gray training shirt, rolled slightly at the hem as she lifted her arms and twisted at the waist. As the fabric shifted, something darker flickered beneath, a spiral of geometric ink stretching across her left rib cage. It was visible for only a second, just long enough. "Did you see that?" one of the young trainees muttered, his voice low but loud enough for the others. A cluster of five stood nearby, early 20s, faces still fresh with the kind of confidence that only new recruits could wear. Two of them stretched lazily. One tapped idly at his smartwatch. The remaining pair had their eyes fixed on Jenna. "Jesus, she's really going through a midlife crisis," one said under his breath. "What's next? A Harley and bad Tinder dates?" Laughter rippled through the group. Jenna didn't blink, didn't glance their way. She folded deeper into her stretch, fingertips brushing against concrete, exhale steady and silent. "Bet she got it to feel dangerous again," another snorted. "Like, look at me. I'm still hardcore." Their ringleader, a smug corporal named Brash, lifted his phone and aimed it right at her. He wasn't subtle. "Yo, stretch again, lady. I'm sending this to the group chat. Operation Cougar Crawl." More laughter, louder this time, cruel and careless. But then the rhythm of boots hit the concrete, heavier, more grounded, intentional. Major General Avery Mason was crossing from the command center, clipboard in hand, flipping through its pages. He didn't stop until someone, caught his eye. His gaze landed on Jenna, then traveled to the symbols trailing along her ribcage. He stopped cold. The clipboard dropped from his fingers, thudding against the ground. "Shut that off," Mason barked, voice sharp as a whip. Startled, the trainees froze. But Mason was already closing the distance. "Phones, now, you two and you." Brash fumbled with his device. "Sir, it was just—" "Lock it down," Mason thundered. "This section. Every recording device. Seize them all, right now." The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Humor bled into dread. The air around them thickened, and the few nearby guards moved like they'd been triggered by tripwire. In seconds, the circle of laughing boys was surrounded by base security. Jenna rose, slow and unhurried, drawing herself up to full height. Across the tarmac, her eyes locked with Mason's. He looked at her like he'd seen a ghost that shouldn't have returned. Inside the simulation command's secured wing, a monitor blinked to life. 3 frames flashed on screen, a woman mid-stretch, a glimpse of exposed skin, and the jagged spiral of tattooed symbols. "Zoom in," one analyst ordered. "Enhancing now," replied the tech beside them. The image sharpened line by line. What looked like abstract shapes became precise, encrypted code, recognizable, and buried deep inside a vault marked Red Echo 9. This can't be real," the officer in charge whispered, eyes glued to the screen. "This was never digitized." "Exactly," the tech replied. "These codes were never entered into any system. They were handwritten, passed hand to hand. Or," murmured the analyst, voice tightening, "etched onto someone who wasn't supposed to make it back." Inside the holding room, the air felt still but tense. It wasn't technically a cell, but the presence of 2 armed guards at the door said otherwise. Jenna sat quietly at the metal table, hands on her thighs, her expression unreadable. Across from her, Major General Mason stood stiffly, arms folded, as though his body was bracing against the weight of old ghost. "Why now?" he finally asked. Jenna didn't flinch. "I stretch here every morning." "Don't screw with me," he growled. "You know what they saw. They saw ink. They assumed something pathetic, attention-seeking." "That part hasn't changed," she replied flatly. Mason leaned in, his tone darkening. "You have Red Echo on your body. Do you understand the weight of that? That operation doesn't exist in any record," she cut in. "Only burn files, whispers, and 3 survivors." He stared at her like the years between had suddenly collapsed. "You weren't supposed to survive." "I know." A heavy silence followed. "And now you're here," he said quietly, "on this base, as a simulation instructor. You worked here quietly, unnoticed for 15 years until this morning, until someone decided to laugh at something they didn't understand." Mason exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "We have to contain this." Jenna offered the ghost of a smile. "You think it's contagious?" He ignored the jab. "Does anyone else know what those codes mean?" "Not unless they were there." He nodded once, then motioned to the guards. "Step outside." When the door clicked shut, his voice dropped. "Why did you do it? Why tattoo it?" Jenna leaned back slowly, eyes far away. "Because it was the only thing that kept me real. When the nightmares blurred into my waking hours, when the VA visits didn't help, when I forgot my own name, I still had that code. I remembered who I was, what I did, what mattered." Mason didn't respond, just watched. "I wasn't trying to make a statement," Jenna added. "I was trying not to disappear." Outside the command wing, the silence was unraveling. The video had been stopped, but not fast enough. One version had slipped past the digital perimeter, captured by a device just outside the secure range. The clip was short, grainy, but unmistakable. An older woman stretching near the tarmac, a flash of black ink across her ribs. Then the audio. "Operation Cougar Crawl, boys!" It was on 2 group chats within minutes, long before anyone traced its source. And by the time the security tried scrubbing it, the damage had already spread. The video landed on a niche military meme page, then a veterans forum. Then someone ran a frame by frame. Then someone else recognized the code, and another remembered Red Echo. And just like that, the story began to stir. Meanwhile, Jenna moved across the base in silence. She hadn't been charged with anything. She'd broken no protocol. But the air around her carried something heavier now, something electric, like the sky before a thunderstorm. Trainees glanced her way twice now, some with embarrassment, others with curiosity, a few with something deeper, awe or fear. She passed the simulator bays, turned through a quiet corridor, and entered her office. Small, bare, familiar. She closed the door behind her, walked to her desk, and sat down. Her hand reached across the surface, touching an old field map, faded, creased, almost obsolete. She traced the edge softly. Red Echo. Once she'd kept a unit alive with nothing more than her voice in a code sketched in ash. Now the same marks, the ones that had saved lives, threatened to dismantle hers. The knock came an hour later. It wasn't base security, it was Colonel Brandt. He stepped into the room, closed the door behind him, and fixed her with the same haunted look Mason had worn. "You didn't just coordinate that mission, did you?" he asked. Jenna didn't speak. "You wrote the fallback code." Still no reply. "I saw the original report, the one before it was locked down. You created the contingency when comms went dark. You memorized the evac sequence and ran it 3 clicks under fire to deliver it." She finally said quietly, "I wasn't alone." "No," Brandt agreed, "but the others didn't make it." There was a long silence. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped. "Why are you really here, Jenna? Why now?" "Because simulations matter. And because they're using rebuilt fragments of Red Echo protocols without any idea what those codes actually mean." Brandt pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You're saying they're misusing them. I'm saying they've gutted the hin, stripped the soul out of something built for survival, turned codes meant for life or death into puzzle pieces for cadets to solve. And people are getting hurt. Already have." Brandt froze. "You have evidence?" She slid a small, encrypted drive across the table. 3 serious malfunctions in the last 4 months. 2 incidents of panic escalation. 1 required hospitalization. All traced back to corrupted sim logic based on fragmented Red Echo matrices. He stared at the drive, then back at her. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you bring this forward sooner?" Jenna met his eyes, unblinking. "Because I didn't think anyone would believe a ghost." Later that night, Jenna sat alone in her quarters. She opened the lockbox beneath her bunk. Inside was a single worn patch, its insignia scorched and faded with age, the emblem of a unit long buried. Beneath that, a photograph. 4 faces, her own among them. Only one other still lived. She picked up a pen and began to write. It wasn't long, but every word carried weight. "We may need to finish what they buried." The command briefing room was thick with silence. Colonel Brandt sat at the far end of the long table, fingers steepled, his gaze locked on the projection behind Jenna. She stood firm, her shoulders squared as a stream of damning data rolled upward. Records, failures, links between corrupted sims and real-world breakdowns. No one interrupted, not once. When she finished, she stepped back. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Mason broke the silence. "If what you're saying is true, we've got trainees running live rescue frameworks built on unstable coding." Jenna nodded. "They've been using old Red Echo logic without context. These protocols weren't designed for training rooms. They were designed for field evasion, under psychological and physical duress." Lieutenant Ellis furrowed his brow. "But they're never in danger. They never even leave the room." Jenna turned to him. "That doesn't matter. Not when the brain believes it's dying." The air seemed to grow heavier. Brandt leaned forward. "How did they even get their hands on Red Echo's code models? I thought they were locked." Jenna hesitated, then tapped the console. A new screen lit up. Archived logs, code fragments. A single name highlighted. "Evermark Systems," she said. Brandt swore under his breath. "Private contractors. They've been injecting pseudo-random variants into our training systems for months." Mason wiped a hand across his face. "Christ, we gave them experimental clearance, and they used memory-coded ops to build these drills." "And someone approved it," Jenna said. Her voice didn't waver. "This isn't a fluke. It's systemic." Murmurs rippled through the room. Men and women, some decorated, some just climbing ranks, grappling with what none of them wanted to admit. Jenna stood still, watching, listening, bracing. Mason turned to her. "You're not just here to raise a red flag." "No," she said. "I'm here to stop this." "How?" She reached into her folder and pulled out a second file. Inside, a chain of emails, internal memos, one marked with a formal request to broaden AI sim deployment. At the bottom, a signature. Colonel Sabrina Hartley. Brandt's eyes narrowed. "She's on the joint oversight panel." "She signed off on Evermark's expansion," Jenna said. "And she knew the codes were still active. She served with Red Echo intel. She knew exactly what she was authorizing." Mason exhaled slowly. You're planning to go public? Not yet, Jenna replied. Not until we stop the rollout. There's a new cadet cycle starting in days. If the update goes live before we fix this, more people get hurt, or worse. A soft chime interrupted them. Brant touched his earpiece. We've got a problem, he muttered. Videos resurfaced. Jenna's head snapped up. Different angle, high res. Someone clipped it from internal surveillance feeds. It's spreading. Spreading fast. Vet forums, spec ops channels all over. Can we contain it? Mason asked. Too late, Brant said. And there's more. Frame-by-frame analysis. Someone overlaid the symbols. They cracked the pattern. The room froze. Jenna didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Mason turned to her. You're exposed. She gave a small nod. Then it's time I stopped hiding. Back in her quarters, Jenna reopened the message she'd started. This time she finished it. Hit send. 10 minutes later, her comm pinged. One reply. You're not alone. The following morning, the base was buzzing, but it wasn't business as usual. Jenna Rhodess, the ghost in the machine, now stood at the front of the main tactical briefing. On either side of her, Mason and Brant. Her name was on the agenda, her voice unwavering. She spoke of Red Echo, of legacy codes abused, of trainees being pushed beyond safe limits by simulations they were never meant to face. This time, no one laughed. No one rolled their eyes. In the back row, a hand lifted. Why didn't you speak up sooner? Jenna looked at the young soldier. Because sometimes it has to hurt before anyone believes it's real. After the briefing, the room emptied out, except for one trainee. He hovered near the exit, hesitant. When he finally approached, his words were soft. My brother, he was in one of those sims. He hasn't been okay since, thank you. Jenna offered a single nod, her gaze gentle. The past was waking, and she wasn't going to vanish with it. That evening, a modest convoy rolled onto base. From one of the vehicles stepped a man with a cane. Silver lined his temples, but his spine was straight, his stride determined despite a clear limp. Jenna emerged to meet him, her breath catching. He smiled, a bittersweet curve of lips marked by memory and loss. You wrote that code on my ribs once, he said. Now let's write the truth across theirs. They shook hands, no reporters, no spotlight, just two survivors carrying a shared reckoning into the sterile lights of the command center. Inside, the silence felt weighted. Colonel Brant stood in the center of the room, a redacted dossier projected behind him. Red Echo schematics flickered like ghosts on the screen. Jenna sat near the back, quiet, composed, and utterly unignorable. All I'm saying, fun, Brant began. Then let me walk with him. Let me guide him through the full protocol. If he's truly ready, it won't matter. Hartley's face hardened, his jaw like iron. Denied, he said flatly. We don't need ghosts disrupting the chain of command. Jenna didn't flinch. Then you're afraid of what I'll prove? He took a slow step forward, every movement deliberate. I'm afraid of teaching the next generation to idolize trauma. Jenna's voice, calm but heavy with meaning, cut through the tension. Then maybe they shouldn't be training for war. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room, gasps, shifting postures, the sound of something unspoken finally finding voice. Colonel Brant moved in fast, stepping between them like a wall. Enough! If we're going to talk evidence, we run tests. That's what this base is for. Give her one session. Hartley didn't move for a moment. Then finally a reluctant nod. One was no observers, no recordings. Jenna's eyes never left his. I'm not the one who's hiding. 2 hours later, the sterile quiet of Simulator Bay 3 was broken only by the low hum of machinery. Jenna stood beside Lieutenant Chase, who was strapping into his neural harness. He looked no older than 25, with tidy blonde hair and posture straight from a cadet manual. His expression hovered somewhere between awe and uncertainty. You're the one with the tattoo, right? He asked, tightening the final strap. Didn't think you were real. Jenna didn't respond. She adjusted her own headset with precision. Command didn't think so either, she said. Let's begin. The sim launched with a flicker of digital code. A dense jungle landscape unfolded around them. 2 hostile zones. Evac point compromised. The trainees' mission. Extract a downed asset, maintain radio silence, and avoid detection. Chase moved with clean efficiency, precise, quick, Textbook perfect. But when the terrain threw its first unexpected curve, a minefield pattern no manual accounted for, he froze. Breath hitched, muscles locked. Jenna didn't speak. She tapped a string of commands into her console. A coded sequence blinked into view. Chase squinted at it. "What is that?" he asked. "The fallback. Echo 9, Stitch," she answered without turning. "It's not in the manual." His voice was hesitant. "No, it's not. It was never meant to be. Now move." And he did. "I saw it." On instinct, through tension and fear and sweat, each motion carried the weight of uncertainty, but also something else. Something earned. He adapted, found rhythm. By the time the simulation ended, his breath was ragged, chest heaving, but he was still standing. And so was the asset. He pulled off his headset slowly, eyes wide, the taste of disbelief still fresh on his tongue. That shouldn't have worked. "But it did," Jenna replied. Outside the bay, Colonel Hartley was waiting like a shadow made real. "You manipulated the simulation," he accused. "No," Jenna said. "I completed it, using undocumented protocols." Hartley stepped in close, his voice low and sharp. "Then maybe it's time you start documenting the truth." She didn't flinch. "You think I don't belong here? That I'm a remnant, a crack in your system?" His glare deepened. "You are." But Jenna's voice held firm. "No, I'm the part you couldn't erase." That evening, under a sky faded to gray, a message appeared on Jenna's secure line. Unsigned, but familiar. A location, a time, and a name she hadn't heard in 15 years. She went. The hangar was dim, half-lit, empty except for a single figure waiting in the shadows. Civilian clothes, a cane, the bearing of someone who'd once worn a uniform like it was skin. He was older, thinner, gray at the temples, but unmistakable. "Captain Rhodess," he said quietly. "I was beginning to think you'd never come back." She stood a few feet away, still. "Didn't think I had to." He gave a slow nod. "Neither did I. Not until I saw what they were doing with the codes." They walked together through the silence. "What do you need from me?" Jenna asked at last. He turned to her, eyes worn and hollowed by time. "To finish what Red Echo started." Back at the base, under harsh white lights in the command center, Colonel Brandt stood once more before the gathered room. A projection flickered behind him. Files, redacted reports, fragmented schematics of Red Echo protocols. Jenna sat near the rear, quiet, unmoving, her presence as weighty as any statement. "All I'm saying," Brandt began again, gesturing to the file, "is if we're going to keep feeding this protocol into our simulations, then we need to understand exactly what it means." Around him, advisors shifted in their seats. Analysts exchanged glances. Junior commanders tried not to stare at the woman in the back, the one who, 15 years ago, was a whispered myth. Now she was rewriting their doctrine. One advisor, tall, with streaks of silver at his temples, raised his voice. "Those codes were buried for a reason. They were unstable, experimental." Jenna's voice was flat. "Unstable, because we weren't meant to survive. But we did, and we remember what worked." Another advisor snorted. "With respect, remembering isn't the same as proving." Brandt cut in firmly. "She's already provided field matches tied to 3 recent simulation failures. These aren't just glitches. We're talking full system spirals. Candidates almost died." "It's anecdotal," came the dismissal. Jenna's tone didn't change. "Then make it empirical. Run my version through the sim, compare outcomes. I'll walk your best trainee through it myself." The room stilled again. Whispers passed like static. Someone coughed. Then Colonel Hartley stepped forward from the shadows. Cold, unyielding, steel in his voice, judgment in his jaw. "No need, Wes," he said. "We already have someone running Red Echo variants in live drills. Lieutenant Chase is leading the current model." Brandt frowned. "Chase? He's green. He's never handled a full intercept sim." Hartley's lip curled. "He's the future, not some dusty relic covered in war stories." The insult hung like smoke in the air. Jenna rose, slow and deliberate. "Then let me walk with him. Let me show him the full protocol. If he's ready, it won't matter." The room didn't breathe, and the system trembled. by remembering what they won't teach you in there. The next dawn bled into the sky with a quiet defiance. Jenna stood alone on the simulator balcony, overlooking the concrete grids below. Wind rippled across the compound like a breath held too long. She didn't move, not until the footsteps returned, this time from multiple directions. Chase was the first to speak, standing tall but humbled. I reviewed my feed. That fallback move saved me. Jenna gave the barest nod. It saved dozens before you, but they buried it because it wasn't clean, because it didn't fit. Lieutenant Avery stepped forward, guilt etched across her face. I followed everything I was told, and I still failed. You followed rules written by people who forgot what pressure feels like, Jenna answered, voice low but firm. Combat doesn't wait for permission. Colonel Brand arrived last, holding a thick folder, fresh logs and new requests. General Hammonds asked for a full assessment of Echo 9 Stitch. He wants to see if the numbers scale. Jenna's gaze didn't waver. They do. Behind her, the young trainees stood a little taller. No more mockery, no more dismissive glances, just curiosity and the quiet tension of belief being born. Not in myth, not in legend, but in something proven. Hartley didn't show. Not that day. Maybe not ever again. But his silence was a louder admission than any protest. By nightfall, Jenna had been assigned a corner office in the old command annex. Nothing grand, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a dusty server link. But it was enough. Enough to begin again. A message pinged her personal console just after lights out. Anonymous sender. Encrypted. One phrase, they're rewriting again. L4 blackout. Protocol mask detected. Jenna closed her eyes, exhaled once. Then she started typing. She would not let them erase what mattered. Not again. Jenna stood in silence as the hum of the bass ebbed around her, the air thick with tension and the weight of unseen eyes. Madsen's frown deepened. Silence. Why now? But then she remembered, the very first lesson they were taught. Before you lead, you listen. Across the compound, deep within the command center, Colonel Sabrina Hartley stared hard at the red echo files, now under intense scrutiny. Her phone buzzed sharply, vibrating against the polished metal desk. A single word lit the screen. She's awake. Without a moment's hesitation, she deleted the message. Yet, even with the screen dark, sleep eluded her that night. Jenna sat quietly in the half-lit stillness of her quarters, her breath shallow as the weight of the day settled over her like the cold, immovable steel of the hangar walls. Outside, the distant drone of aircraft engines threaded through the wind, an eerie lullaby of machines and memory. She reached for the folder she had tucked away earlier, fingers gliding over the edges of a dossier that held more than technical data. It was a fragile archive of victories, sacrifices, and names both honored and lost. Her phone buzzed again, cutting through her reflection. It was a message from Madsen. 3 words. Ready to start. Jenna allowed herself a faint, quiet smile. They were standing on the edge of something vast. This was only the beginning. The simulation bay the next morning was charged with energy, not excitement, but a sharp, expectant anxiety. Lights blinked methodically on control panels. The air buzzed faintly with static and anticipation. Jenna and Madsen stood shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by consoles in the crisp, clinical scent of electronics. The trainees, usually restless, were focused, aware that this session wasn't ordinary. Jenna's voice sliced through the tension, steady and clear. This isn't about speed, it's about precision, about remembering that behind every code, behind every maneuver, there's a life at stake. Madsen nodded, absorbing each word with a fierce attentiveness. The simulation initiated, a chaotic extraction scenario under fire, communications compromised, terrain hostile, and unfamiliar. It was exactly the kind of shifting landscape designed to crack focus and scatter thought. Madsen navigated the field with honed instinct, her decisions echoing the lessons Jenna had embedded in her years before. When a false evac beacon flared, a calculated trap, Madsen froze for the briefest second. Then, drawing from a buried Echo 9 contingency sequence, she rewrote it with seamless clarity. Every movement from then on unfolded with decisive intent. The trainees remained silent, eyes locked on the unfolding chaos that blurred the line between simulation and reality. When it ended, not only had Madsen achieved the objective, but she'd salvaged her digital team from near certain failure. The screens confirmed it. Efficiency metrics high, loss rates minimal. Jenna didn't need the numbers to know. The legacy code still pulsed with relevance. Later that day, in a stark briefing room filled with equal parts resistance and curiosity, Jenna presented her case. Her data was unimpeachable. The modernized, sanitized simulation models had quietly been putting lives at risk. The legacy codes, buried beneath bureaucracy and forgotten protocol, offered undeniable tactical advantage. Hartley sat up front, arms folded, jaw set. His demeanor teetered between stubborn skepticism and reluctant recognition. "You expect us to rewrite decades of operational doctrine?" he challenged. Jenna didn't blink. "No, I expect us to stop pretending progress means erasing what actually worked." The room shifted, not just in volume but in weight, a silent crack through old armor. The debate that followed was turbulent, but change had crept in, irreversible. The ghosts of Red Echo weren't going to vanish. They demanded reckoning. That evening, Jenna lingered alone in the dim mess hall. The base was quiet again. The storm paused, but not passed. The door creaked open. Madsen stepped in, eyes steady, burning with purpose. "I want to learn everything," she said. Jenna studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you need to understand the silence, too." Madsen tilted her head, the silence again. Jenna's gaze drifted, distant. War isn't just bullets. It's waiting, watching, knowing the cost of a word, when to speak, when not to. They sat side by side, the fluorescent lights dimming overhead. In that hush, something deeper was forged, more than a mentorship. It was a communion of scars, a kinship born of wounds no simulation could replicate. Days turned into weeks. Jenna's sessions became more than exercises. They became a movement. Trainees lined up for her guidance, and her protocols were no longer fringe. They were a foundation. Even as resistance lingered, the momentum shifted. Leaks about simulation manipulation stirred media storms, and the tide of public pressure could no longer be ignored. Hartley, once an iron wall, began to yield. Slowly, carefully. Cooperation emerged from the rubble of pride. Jenna moved deliberately. She rebuilt more than drills. She rebuilt trust, respect, the sacred thread of memory between those who survived and those who never made it back. One night, someone knocked softly on her door. An old comrade stepped through, cane in hand, eyes heavy with history. He had once led Red Echo's field operations, a phantom from her past. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The war had changed, but the mission hadn't. They began to map a new campaign, not of weapons, but of remembrance and protection. As the revised training protocols neared launch, Jenna found herself once more at the edge of the runway. The early light cast a faint shimmer across the tattoo on her ribs, Red Echo 9, faded but defiant. A young recruit approached her, nervous and eager. Jenna turned to face them. "Ready?" "Yeah, she asked. The recruit gave a sharp nod. "Good," she said, "because this isn't just about simulations. This is about lives, and every one of them matters." She turned toward the rising sun. The battle wasn't over. But this time she wasn't alone. That night, Jenna stood once again in the quiet briefing room. The hum of the base now felt familiar, like the pulse of something just beginning to awaken. After everything, the fights, the closed doors, the thinly veiled threats, she had carved out a victory. Small, maybe, but real. Red Echo's legacy protocols were no longer hidden. They were about to become standard. Still, Jenna understood more than most. Paper victories were easy. The real fight always came afterward. The door swung open gently. Madsen stepped in, her eyes tired but sharp. "Ready for the next step?" she asked. Jenna nodded. "It's not just about drills anymore. It's about how we carry this forward, how we teach them to survive, yes, but also how we show them the cost of every decision they make." Madsen dropped into a chair, flicking through simulation results on her tablet. The cadets are responding, but some of the brass still resisting. Jenna leaned in. Change always feels like a threat to those clinging to what they know. But look at these numbers. They're not just statistics. They're lives, the difference between panic and precision. A soft alert chimed on her comm. She checked the message. Encrypted. Unfamiliar sender. She opened it. We're watching. Stop digging, or there will be consequences. Her breath caught, jaw clenched. This wasn't about legacy anymore. Someone wanted to bury the truth, and they were willing to fight dirty. By dawn, the air on base had shifted. The undercurrent of resistance was no longer hidden. Sabotage was no longer a whisper. It was a probability. Jenna moved swiftly, drawing in her allies. Madsen, veterans who'd seen too much to stay silent, and a few unexpected officers, people tired of silence being the price of survival. In a locked room, they began to plan. Jenna had called them together with a sense of urgency that left no room for ambiguity. Her voice was steady, but beneath it was a fire that refused to be extinguished. This isn't just about protocol anymore, she said, her gaze sweeping across the room of trusted allies. It's about truth, about exposing those who hide behind their rank and authority while putting real lives in danger. The gravity of her words settled over the group like a storm front. Silent nods followed. No one argued. Plans were drawn with precision. Every simulation would be monitored relentlessly, every anomaly logged and archived. And if the time came, they would go public, no matter the consequences. Elsewhere, behind a polished mahogany desk, Colonel Sabrina Hartley observed the developments through a narrowed lens of suspicion. Her fingertips tapped rhythmically on the glossy surface, a nervous tell she rarely exhibited. The recent influx of inquiries, reports, and encrypted messages had disturbed her carefully constructed equilibrium. Jenna wasn't just a relic from a sealed past. She was a spark threatening to ignite every hidden fuse. Hartley picked up the phone. Her orders were concise but sharp. Lock down communications, ramp up internal surveillance, and identify the origin of the unauthorized transmissions. As directives dispersed, the base entered a heightened state. Security systems shifted posture. Surveillance logs were scrubbed. Data trails were deliberately scrambled. But Jenna's team was agile, experienced, and motivated. Every attempt to bury the truth was met with a countermove, louder, sharper, more visible. In a dim, windowless room late one evening, Jenna and Madsen hunched over a terminal glowing with fragments of training footage. Lines of data scrolled across the screen, seemingly routine, until a slight deviation broke the pattern. Subtle but intentional. An unfamiliar sequence had been stitched into the simulation architecture, one that mimicked Red Echo's cadence but diverged in dangerous ways. Jenna leaned forward, her brow furrowing. "This isn't random," she said, voice low and grave. "Someone's deliberately rewriting the system, for control, not improvement." Madsen's throat tightened. But for what purpose? What could possibly justify tampering with live training data? Jenna's reply was measured but heavy with knowing. Control, the illusion of progress, wrapped around a hunger for power. And the losses, they're just collateral to them. The revelation forced their next move. Jenna quietly organized a forensic audit of the entire simulation platform. In a secured lab isolated from standard systems, she and her team dissected source code, patch histories, and encryption keys. What they found was damning. Lines of unauthorized code traced directly to a clandestine contractor, a name tied to multiple classified dealings and high-level endorsements. The infection wasn't peripheral. It was embedded at the core. Not rogue sabotage, systemic manipulation sanctioned, or at least ignored, by those at the top. The scope of the corruption shook even the most seasoned analysts. Jenna drafted a detailed report and prepared for what would be her most high-stakes briefing yet. When she entered the commander's office with the report in hand, the tension was almost tangible. She presented the findings without embellishment. "This is beyond a software glitch," she said. "It's a breach of institutional trust. And if we don't act, we compromise not just lives, but the legitimacy of everything we stand for." The commander remained unreadable for a long moment, then finally gave a curt nod. "An investigation will be opened. But tread carefully. Not everyone wants this exposed." And so the days turned into weeks, the pressure mounting with every uncovered detail. Jenna found brief moments of respite in her conversations with Madsen, who had grown from a cautious recruit into an indispensable partner. One night, as they reviewed another round of field data, Madsen looked at her with quiet clarity. "You carry your past like armor," she said, "but you also carry the future in how you fight." Jenna offered a faint smile, one lined with fatigue and resilience. "I carry both. That's why I can't stop." The breakthrough came suddenly, as if destiny had been holding its breath. An anonymous whistleblower from Evermark Systems reached out through a secure channel, offering undeniable proof. Internal documents, logs of overridden protocols, messages linking senior officers to deliberate manipulation. The evidence was damning. There was no room left for speculation. The conspiracies Jenna had long suspected were now plain in writing. She immediately turned the materials over to the investigative team. The puzzle pieces clicked into place. This wasn't an isolated failure. It was systemic betrayal. As the scope of the conspiracy widened, Jenna returned to the very hangar where it had all begun, where she had first been summoned back into the fold. The man with the cane, a quiet presence from her Red Echo days, stood beside her once again. "It's time," he said. She nodded. "This isn't just a mission anymore," she replied. "It's a reckoning." Armed with ironclad proof and a circle of allies hardened by experience, Jenna stepped into the war she hadn't chosen, but had been destined to fight. The road ahead was murky, fraught with political maneuvering and backlash. Yet for the first time in years, hope shimmered on the horizon. A hope forged not from naivety, but from the belief that justice, though delayed, could still be delivered. The day of the hearing arrived. Jenna entered the darkened briefing room, its fluorescent lights casting long shadows on the walls. The base seemed to hold its breath. This was the culmination of everything. Months of collecting evidence, training recruits, and sidestepping sabotage. Before her sat a panel of high-ranking officers, their faces a blend of skepticism and wary curiosity. Jenna launched into her presentation with unwavering focus. She laid out every manipulation of the Red Echo protocols, how sequences had been distorted, how entire training modules were compromised. Her words landed like hammer blows. One colonel, sharp-eyed and hardened by decades of command, leaned forward, voice tight. "These revelations threaten the foundation of our doctrine. What do you suggest we do to restore trust?" Jenna didn't flinch. "We start with transparency, open audits, independent oversight. We return to the protocols that were tested under fire, not the ones designed for optics and shortcuts." A ripple moved through the room. Whispers, uncertainty, and then chaos. An aide burst in, speaking hurriedly to the panel's chair. His face paled. "A classified training video has been leaked," he said, almost breathless. "It's gone viral. Shows corrupted simulations. The footage is real." A chill ran through the room. Jenna's chest tightened. The battle had spilled into the public sphere now, and there would be no containing it. She pushed forward, arguing fiercely for full transparency. "We can't afford silence anymore," she told them. "The only way forward is truth." But resistance lingered. Concerns over reputations, contracts, political alliances. Hartley's name came up repeatedly. Some still pushed to shield those implicated. Outside, the leak ignited firestorms on military networks and public forums. Jenna became both hero and target, hailed for courage, vilified for defiance. But she didn't let the noise derail her. Instead, she worked tirelessly to coordinate responses, secure the chain of custody for evidence, and protect trainees exposed to flawed simulations. One night, Madsen approached her with quiet determination etched on her face. "I'm ready," she said simply. "They need to hear the truth, not from reports or memos, but from someone who lived through it." Jenna studied her, pride and caution mingling in her gaze. "Then we do this together." What followed were grueling days of testimony. Congressional panels convened. Jenna stood before them, voice unwavering, recounting every twist of the story with precision and honesty. It was far from over. The shift was undeniable. Slowly but steadily, policies began to reflect a newfound commitment to oversight. Training protocols across the base were rewritten, rebuilt upon the foundation Jenna Rhodess had carved out with grit, clarity, and sacrifice. Her legacy had begun to shape the present. Still, deep within, Jenna understood this was not the end of the war. It was merely a pause between battles. The long campaign for integrity, respect, and cultural transformation within the armed forces had only just begun. She stood again at the edge of the runway, morning air pressing cool against her skin. Beneath her jacket, the faded tattoo of the red Echo 9 code clung to her ribs like a buried beacon, a symbol too personal to explain yet too powerful to ignore. The rising sun painted the sky with slender fingers of light, brushing the horizon in tones of quiet fire. Her boots crunched lightly on the gravel as she moved forward, every step steady with renewed purpose. The past week's trials hadn't crushed her. They had crystallized something essential inside her. Each scar etched on her body, every sleepless night and whispered doubt, had become part of her armor. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was forging a path for others to follow. Inside the training facility, the energy was unmistakable. Officers, instructors, and fresh-faced recruits were already gathering in the main hall, some with guarded expressions, others wide-eyed and eager. The newly revamped Rush program was launching today, and Jenna, standing at the helm, was not just an instructor. She was the symbol of its rebirth. Her eyes scanned the room, anchoring on familiar faces. Lieutenant Madsen stood near the front, shoulders squared, exuding quiet confidence, the kind built from experience and hard-won trust. A few veterans who had once backed her in hushed rooms now stood in open support. Even a few skeptics were present, their postures uncertain, as if unsure whether to challenge or simply observe. Jenna cleared her throat, letting the murmur fade into silence. Then she began. "Good morning. Today, we're not just preparing for combat. We're preparing to survive, not just for ourselves, but for each other. The codes you'll learn are not strings of cold data. They're forged in blood. They've been paid for in sacrifice, written across the lives of those who came before you, and they demand your respect." The room stilled. Her words didn't just instruct, they carried weight. And when she began explaining the origin of the Red Echo Protocol, no one dared interrupt. She spoke of the mission that birthed the tattoo on her ribs, of encrypted messages and life or death maneuvers, of the hidden scars that no simulation could replicate. Each moment she shared was steeped in raw truth, lessons carved from pain, carried forward through will. Her lecture flowed between tactical breakdowns and personal memory, creating a tapestry of meaning. It wasn't just about procedures, it was about survival, loyalty, responsibility. The recruits sat forward in their seats, absorbing not only the mechanics of the system, but the spirit that upheld it. When the session ended, she led the group into the simulation bays. There, in the stark white corridors and humming walls of technology, reality, and training merged. Today's exercise was grueling by design, a hostage extraction embedded in hostile terrain, where misinformation, shifting allegiances, and digital interference made every second matter. Jenna observed carefully, her gaze sharp and unrelenting. This was the proving ground, where fear surfaced and instincts were laid bare. Some trainees hesitated, others faltered. But Madsen moved with precision, her grasp of Red Echo's fallback sequences giving her an edge, dodging digital traps that swallowed others whole. Jenna gave the faintest nod of approval. This was more than a successful simulation. It was vindication, but not everyone excelled. A few stumbled through the chaos, losing critical time and simulated lives. Jenna didn't chastise. She pulled them aside, speaking low and firm. Not about their mistakes, but about the why behind every code, every sequence. That context, she reminded them, could be the difference between surviving and becoming another forgotten cautionary tale. As twilight approached, she gathered the group once more. Dust floated in golden shafts of light, filtering through the bay's narrow windows. Her voice was steady. "Remember, this isn't about checking boxes, it's about carrying the weight of your decisions. These protocols were born in fire. Honor them. Honor the ones who didn't make it back. You owe them that much." Outside, whispers of change traveled fast. Around the base, murmurs turned to conversation. Word of the program's renewal spread, catching the attention of command and even the press. Jenna's phone buzzed. Lena Marquez, the journalist who had followed her journey, recording every trial, every breakthrough. The story's gaining traction, the message read. People want to see what reform really looks like. They want to meet the people behind the scars. Jenna smiled, fatigue lining her eyes. Then we give them truth, she replied. No headlines, no noise, just the truth. A few days later, Jenna was summoned. The base's highest-ranking officers convened in a sterile conference room around a polished table. Colonel Brandt sat to her left. Lieutenant General Hammond loomed at the head. A half-dozen other senior officials flanked them, their expressions unreadable. Brandt spoke first. Miss Rhodess, the improvements you've spearheaded are undeniable. Performance metrics are up. Response times are sharper. Morale has improved, but scrutiny follows progress. General Hammond leaned in. We're considering scaling the Red Echo program, expanding it to other installations. But success on a larger scale demands something more than performance. It requires trust, transparency, accountability. Jenna nodded, resolute. Scaling with integrity means refusing to repeat the mistakes we've already paid for. We hold the line. What followed was a tangle of logistics, budgets, jurisdiction, politics. Jenna absorbed it all, knowing this was the next battlefield. She would need not just determination, but precision, influence, allies. As the meeting ended, Hammond approached her alone. You've done well, but the higher the climb, the more vicious the resistance. Be ready. Jenna met his eyes squarely. I am. And yet, just as momentum built, new threats surfaced. Jenna discovered certain contractors involved in simulation development had ties to groups profiting from the flawed systems, those with vested interests in blocking reform. Quietly, she pulled in Madsen and other trusted allies. Together, they launched covert audits, combing through code and procurement logs. What they uncovered was disturbing. Lines of backdoor code embedded in critical systems, attempts to sabotage updated training sequences. The intent was clear: undermine the program before it could expand. One night, her encrypted comms pinged. An anonymous whistleblower from within the contractor network had reached out. The message warned of a planned attack, a deliberate glitch during an upcoming high-profile demonstration that would discredit the program. Jenna acted instantly. She alerted security, restructured the simulation layout, and drafted a countermeasure plan. This wouldn't be a presentation, it would be a test, not just of Red Echo, but of vigilance itself. And the stakes had never been higher. The room had been filled with anticipation. Expectations ran high as the simulation unfolded, but any attempts at tampering were swiftly intercepted and neutralized. Jenna's meticulous preparation paid off. Her trainees executed the Red Echo sequences with a level of precision and fluidity that silenced doubt and earned them genuine applause. The crowd's response wasn't just approval, it was relief, validation, hope reborn. Afterward, Jenna stepped forward, addressing the assembly with quiet authority. This is the future of tactical training, she began. Not sanitized, not convenient, but real and necessary. Her words echoed far beyond the walls of the facility, rippling through military networks, briefing rooms, and even the insulated chambers of policy forums. A shift had begun, subtle but undeniable. Later that evening, back at the base, Jenna stood alone in the calm of her quarters, lost in thought. She rested a hand over her ribs, where the once classified tattoo of Red Echo 9 was inked into her skin. It no longer felt like a curse she had to carry in silence. Now it was a symbol of loss, yes, but also of hope, of truth reclaimed, and the duty to keep fighting for it. Madsen joined her by the window, his silhouette cast against the amber sky as the sun slipped beneath the horizon. You think it'll last? He asked quietly, his voice edged with cautious optimism. Jenna didn't look away from the fading light. She smiled faintly, but her voice was resolute. It has to, for every soldier who'll carry these codes forward. The battle for transparency, for integrity, was still far from over. But Jenna Rhodess was no longer standing in that fight alone. She had allies, she had momentum, and most of all, she had purpose. They stood together in the gathering twilight, the quiet hum of the command center around them. This place, once a silent witness to outdated systems and compromised simulations, now pulsed with new energy. Yet even amid the light, the steel beams overhead reminded her of the weight she bore. Responsibility was heavy, unrelenting. The path from shadowy operative to the architect of reform had been grueling, but the true conflict was only beginning. winning the trust, the belief, the hearts of those who still doubted. Her phone buzzed gently in her hand. A message from Madsen lit up the screen. We're ready to push forward. The trainees are responding, but resistance is growing. Jenna exhaled, steadying herself. There was no backing down now. At dawn the next morning, she called a strategy meeting in the operations room. Gathered around the table were hand-picked instructors, seasoned veterans, cyber intelligence specialists, and a few junior officers who had proven their loyalty. All of them shared one goal: protect the integrity of the Red Echo protocols and safeguard the lives of every soldier who would rely on them. They laid out plans for expanding the training curriculum, integrating layers of psychological conditioning, real-world unpredictability, and error resilience. At the same time, a quiet watch was set, covert surveillance of internal systems to detect sabotage, data manipulation, or targeted misinformation. They were not just building a program, they were defending it. Word of Jenna's reforms continued to spread. From Pentagon hallways to underground veterans networks, her name surfaced more frequently, met with both praise and thinly veiled contempt. Some powerful figures lauded her bravery, others whispered of insubordination. Jenna remained grounded. She understood this terrain. It wasn't just about tactics or politics. It was about navigating the slow, brutal churn of institutional change. Transparency without diplomacy was just noise. On the training floor, she watched Lieutenant Madsen leading a team through a simulation drill. His posture was sharp, his commands precise, and his control of the Red Echo sequences flawless. He moved like someone who understood not just the protocol, but the meaning behind it. Jenna allowed herself a rare flicker of pride. It was working. Still, she didn't ease up. Complacency was the true enemy. She kept refining the modules, adding high-stress scenarios, moral ambiguity exercises, emotional conditioning. This training wasn't just about surviving war. It was about surviving after war. One night, as Jenna returned to her quarters, she was met by an unexpected visitor, a military chaplain she'd once served with during the original Red Echo missions. Time had weathered him, but his presence brought something gentle into the room. Memory, grief, faith. They sat together in quiet conversation, reflecting on the invisible wounds that soldiers carried home, the battles that never made it to debriefs, the ghosts no one saluted. Jenna listened more than she spoke. He didn't come with orders or criticism, just perspective. And that night, it mattered. Weeks passed. The program gained traction. New recruits immersed themselves in the complexity and realism of the simulations. Even skeptics found themselves unsettled, not by propaganda, but by irrefutable outcomes. Trainees were sharper, quicker, more prepared for chaos. The base evolved into something rare, a crucible of innovation and remembrance, where old codes met new principles. But threats remained. Sabotage came not in explosions, but in whispers. A corrupted log here, a shipment rerouted there, unexplained system glitches, anonymous warnings slipped into inboxes. Jenna didn't blink. She gathered her team, exposed the tricks, and transformed suspicion into unity. She turned every threat into a lesson, every shadow into a reason to stand taller. Then came the invitation. Jenna was summoned to speak at a national defense symposium, a stage rarely given to simulation instructors, let alone ones with a history like hers. It was a moment she hadn't asked for, but one she knew she had to own. On that stage, in front of generals, advisors, and analysts, she didn't speak in buzzwords. She spoke about trust, about betrayal, about the difference between training to win and training to survive. She spoke of Red Echo not as a product, but as a promise, one earned with pain, loss, and perseverance. Her words reverberated, igniting conversations in war colleges, think tanks, and classified corridors. When she returned to base, something had shifted in her. The burden of the tattoo on her ribs had become something more, an inheritance, a torch. She stood once more at the edge of the runway, the sun bleeding orange into the concrete below, and knew the war wasn't over. But the tide had turned. With Madsen, with others rising to join her, they were building something that could last. Early morning light spilled through the windows of the base's operations center. Jenna stood still, her eyes on the real-time map pulsing with updates from active training zones. What had begun as a revival of forgotten protocols had grown into a full-scale battle, no longer against enemy combatants, but against a rot that lived inside the system. The resistance wasn't ideological, it was systemic, hidden behind bureaucracy, cloaked in procedure. The sabotage she uncovered wasn't accidental. It had purpose, and that purpose was control, preserving the comfort of those profiting from outdated simulations while endangering the lives of every soldier on the ground. She was no stranger to pressure, but this demanded a different kind of courage. Surgical, relentless. The briefing room filled with an eclectic audience, defense inspectors, legal counsel, generals, a panel from the Inspector General's office. The air bristled with skepticism, but beneath it, a fragile hope. Jenna addressed them with clarity, no theatrics. She laid bare the system's failures, how contractors with deep political ties had manipulated simulation data, erasing flaws, altering outcomes, undermining soldier safety, how the very training meant to save lives had been repurposed to serve convenience and profit. She brought evidence, documented logs, emails, digital forensics, not speculation, proof. This wasn't a rogue anomaly, she said. This was a pattern, a willful failure to confront hard truths. One of the generals leaned forward, his voice heavy with decades of service. This is a grave accusation. How do we ensure this never happens again? Jenna met his gaze. Her answer was quiet, steady. With transparency, with accountability, by giving power back to those who carry these codes, the soldiers, the instructors, and by dismantling the walls that kept them in the dark. The session wasn't over, but neither was she. Not by a long shot. Pointed questions flew, the room charged with heat, not from the air, but from the clash of principle and fear. Some officers spoke with alarm, voicing their anxiety over the potential damage to reputation and the risk of disrupting operations. Others, however, began to gravitate toward Jenna's call for change. Her vision, bold and unapologetically honest, stirred something long dormant in them. By the time the meeting adjourned, a resolution had been passed to launch a full-scale independent audit, an unprecedented sweep through every simulation software and training protocol. For the first time, the very core of the system was to be held accountable. But even as the bureaucracy inched toward transparency, Jenna's personal battleground became far more dangerous. Surveillance around her intensified. Her routine was no longer just hers. Every step she took was shadowed. Every glance over her shoulder sharpened by unease. Security tightened with quiet urgency. Unmarked vehicles loitered near her living quarters, their presence more than coincidental. Threats began slipping into her encrypted inbox, anonymous, carefully worded but unmistakably hostile. Each message was a chilling reminder. The truth had powerful enemies, and they were watching her. Yet, amid this growing menace, support began to sprout. Tentative at first, then steadily blooming in unexpected places. Veterans groups, long silent on internal affairs, issued statements lauding her courage. Younger officers, inspired by her unshakable resolve, began passing along information in whispers, each revelation a thread that helped unravel the deeper web of deception. Slowly, methodically, a network formed around her, built not on rank or power, but on trust, purpose, and a fierce loyalty to truth. Late one night, Jenna sat beside Lieutenant Madsen, poring over new data in a dimly lit room. The air was heavy with focus, the silence broken only by the occasional tapping of keys. Then she froze. Her eyes narrowed at a peculiar anomaly in the code, an incongruous patch that didn't align with any standard framework. It looked like a patch, but it was more than that. It was a mask. Madsen leaned in, frowning. "This isn't just sloppy sabotage," we murmured. "It's intentional obfuscation. Someone went out of their way to erase any trace of what they did." Jenna nodded slowly, her face hardening. "And that someone, they're closer than we think. This isn't just about code, it's about betrayal. Not from outside, but from within." That realization hit like a cold wave. They weren't merely fighting faulty programming or rogue algorithms. They were confronting betrayal at the institutional level. It was a wound from within the system, deep and festering. Galvanized by this discovery, the team doubled down. Evidence was sealed under heightened security. Cyber defenses were fortified. Contact was initiated with external oversight bodies, giving the investigation an integrity it had sorely lacked. Jenna took point, drafting a new set of protocols designed not just to block future breaches, but to change the culture that allowed such manipulation to fester. She wove together technical reforms and human accountability, because fixing code wasn't enough. They had to fix the people behind it. As the truth came to light, the department had no choice but to publicly acknowledge the depth of the issue. Denial gave way to accountability. Disciplinary proceedings began against several contractors and internal figures linked to the scandal. Among them was Colonel Sabrina Hartley. Her resistance, once seen as mere professional disagreement, now stood as a symbol of the entrenched systems Jenna was fighting to dismantle. Hartley was formally reassigned, pending a broader inquiry. Reforms swept through the base. Training programs were restructured. Oversight committees, long dismissed as ceremonial, were empowered with real authority. And Jenna's once disregarded red echo sequences, cleaned, verified, and restored, became the new standard across the system. The shift wasn't instant, but it was tangible. Trust, shattered and frayed, began the slow process of repair. In rare moments of solitude, Jenna allowed herself to reflect. The personal cost of this crusade had been immense. The inked lines of the red echo tattoo etched along her ribs had always symbolized more than identity. They were a private ledger of sacrifice. Once a mark she kept hidden, it had become something more. A badge of resilience, a quiet proclamation of survival and leadership. One warm afternoon, she stood before a new group of trainees. The sun poured across the tarmac, illuminating the mix of anticipation and nerves on their faces. These were not just recruits. They were the future. And she did more than hand them manuals or issue orders. She told them stories. Stories of nights spent in enemy terrain, of friendships forged and lost in silence, of betrayals that left scars deeper than any wound. She spoke not with bitterness, but with conviction. She urged them to protect what mattered most, the truth, to never let comfort blind them to danger, to never forget that complacency could kill. The battle wasn't over, Jenna knew that. But each time a young soldier stepped forward and embraced the principles she fought for, it was a small victory, a piece of the future reclaimed. Twilight stretched long shadows across the airfield. Standing quietly by the runway, Jenna allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The horizon before her was still vast and uncertain, but she no longer stood at its edge alone, Barish. This mission, this fight was no longer a solitary pursuit. It was a living vow, shared by many, to honor those who came before and defend what lay ahead. The echoes of Red Echo 9 lived on, not only in code but in the steady heartbeat of those willing to listen. And as the sun crept up over the horizon, casting light across the now awakened base, Jenna Rhodess moved forward through the morning mist. Her steps were deliberate, measured. Every breath she took reminded her of how far she'd come and how much farther there was still to go. The Red Echo protocols, once buried in shadows and sabotage, were finally rising into the light. No longer a relic, but the foundation of a new era in military readiness. Inside the training complex, a current of energy charged the air. Recruits just out of basic mingled with seasoned instructors, all gathered to witness the formal launch of the revitalized program. Jenna surveyed them from the edge of the room, the anxious expressions, the hopeful ones, fingers clenching notebooks and equipment. These weren't just participants. They were torchbearers. She stepped up to the platform and the room stilled. Her voice rang out, unwavering. "Welcome to a new chapter." She paused, her eyes moving across the faces before her. "Today, we go beyond tactics and drills. We embrace the deeper truths, what every line of code means, the lives it protects, the sacrifices it stands upon." She walked them through the legacy of Red Echo, the nights spent deep in hostile ground where each flicker of signal, each breath, might mean survival or loss. Her tattoo, once silent, now spoke volumes, a marker not just of pain, but of unyielding leadership. Then Lieutenant Madsen took the floor. His words were candid, his tone steady as he recounted the simulations and how the restored protocols had already saved lives. The recruits listened, captivated, changed. The exercises that followed were relentless. Complex simulations tested them with variables that shifted by the minute. Jenna watched from the control room, eyes fixed on live feeds, heart monitoring, heat maps. Every clean maneuver, every sound decision was a step toward restoring faith in the system. Even with their progress, she stayed wary. The threat of internal sabotage had not vanished. She ordered constant audits, reinforced cyber firewalls, and deepened ties with those brave enough to blow the whistle. Her leadership was now more than a title. It was a force of nature, both protector and guide. Beyond the daily drills, Jenna entered the political arena. She met with Defense Department heads, lawmakers, and reform advocates. She pushed for systems of transparency, of support for both active service members and veterans. Each meeting was a battle of its own, one where she chipped away at years of silence and reluctance. Beyond the base, the story of Red Echo revival ignited public attention. News outlets carried images of her, of those who stood with her. Headlines spoke of courage, integrity, and sacrifice. She became a symbol, not by choice, but by necessity. And in moments of calm, she often found herself at the Veteran Center. There, surrounded by those who had lived through the same wars of truth and silence, she didn't need to speak. The quiet nods were enough. The mission was never just hers. It belonged to them all. Civic organizations and advocacy groups. She refused to let the movement falter under pressure or revert to the quiet compromises of the past. Each morning she rose before dawn, walking the length of the simulation wing before the day's chaos began. The silence there held echoes of battles once fought, both in the field and behind closed doors. As her boots echoed against polished floors, Jenna felt the pulse of transformation, the steady heartbeat of change that demanded vigilance but also offered hope. She often revisited the mural in the Eastern Corridor, the one depicting a soldier mid-leap across burning terrain, flanked by shadows representing past traumas. Beneath it were etched the words, "Legacy is the courage to question and the will to rebuild." Jenna had chosen that quote herself, believing it embodied everything Red Echo stood for. Lieutenant Madsen, now increasingly regarded as her right hand, brought fresh energy to every session. His approach blended textbook precision with a deeply personal awareness of the stakes. He often stayed late with Jenna, poring over data, analyzing feedback, and brainstorming ways to adjust modules. His growth reminded her that the next generation of leaders needed not only tools but models, examples of integrity in action. Jenna maintained regular correspondence with Lena Marquez, the journalist whose early coverage had catapulted the story into national focus. Lena's latest piece, a deep dive into whistleblower testimonies and psychological fallout from prior simulation abuse, had sparked another round of internal investigations. Jenna forwarded the article to every senior officer she knew, unapologetic about her tactics. The truth, she insisted, wasn't something to whisper about. It had to be carved into policy. Still, not all welcomed her momentum. Colonel Sabrina Hartley, with her deep ties to the original Red Echo intel design, subtly contested Jenna's decisions, often under the guise of logistical delays or technical reviews. Jenna, however, had learned to decode the language of deflection. She countered every delay with documentation, every silence with transparency, ensuring that reform could not be quietly buried. In closed-door meetings with General Hammond, Jenna made her case over and over. That simulation reform wasn't optional. It was a national security imperative. She walked him through detailed analytics, correlations between outdated modules and combat trauma, studies linking ethical blind spots to misfired missions. He listened, more thoughtfully each time, until one morning he said simply, "It's time we change the doctrine." Later that week, the base hosted its first Red Echo Reform Symposium, an unprecedented gathering of active service members, veterans, psychologists, policy advisors, and tech developers. Jenna stood at the center of it all, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. She spoke of fear, not as weakness, but as signal, of resilience, not as armor, but as process, and of truth, not as threat, but as compass. The unnamed man with the cane reappeared at the symposium's close, standing in the back of the hall with a quiet nod of respect. She hadn't seen him since the early investigations. His presence was both balm and reminder. They spoke only briefly, but it was enough. "You never stopped," he said, "even when the map was blank." "I couldn't," she replied, her gaze drifting to the tattoo hidden beneath her sleeve. "Some battles aren't meant to be walked away from." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the voices of the new recruits, many of whom had once doubted her. Now they mirrored her language, asked her questions, requested one-on-one sessions. They carried notes scribbled in the margins of her lectures. They were learning not just how to fight, but how to lead. And Jenna, once buried by conspiracy and silence, now stood as the architect of a new doctrine, one built not just on tactics, but on trust, not just on strength, but on sight. The war for reform was far from over, but in every classroom, in every simulation, in every whispered thank you from a soldier who finally felt seen, Jenna Rhodess knew this legacy would outlive her, and it was worth everything. As twilight draped the airfield in a hush of amber light, Jenna Rhodess stood near the runway, her gaze set on a horizon that promised no easy answers, only purpose. The tattoo along her ribs, once a private echo of a classified past, had become something more than a mark. It had evolved into a quiet banner, a call for those who still believed that honor could exist above blind obedience. Every hardship had tempered her, refined her mission. And though the war for truth was far from over, she knew now with unshakable clarity, each hard-won step she took forged a path towards something nobler, for those who served and for those who would. In the weeks that followed, her life turned into a storm of meetings, cross-agency briefings, and late-night strategy sessions. Jenna immersed herself in the National Task Force with tireless resolve. The room was often tense, alive with the friction of power. Military leaders, legislative aides, veterans advocates, and national security analysts all trying to steer a colossal institution toward accountability. Jenna, for all her experience in the field, now had to master the battlefield of bureaucracy, where progress meant diplomacy, restraint, and a relentless focus on values. Her first public hearing was held in a grand chamber, thick with formality and under the glow of 100 watchful eyes. She stepped up to the podium with a deliberate calm, steel hidden behind the softness of her voice. Senators, representatives, officers, and journalists filled the room. Supporters leaned forward, skeptics folded arms. Flashbulbs clicked as Jenna began to speak, not just about numbers and performance benchmarks, but about the lives behind them. She told stories, real ones, of soldiers broken by failed simulations, then made whole again through revised protocols, of young recruits who found not just strength, but purpose, of instructors who finally felt heard. She underscored the urgent need to protect whistleblowers, fund mental health care, and restore transparency to an increasingly opaque system. Her message was unwavering. If the military could not protect its own people, its strength was hollow. There was resistance, questions about cost, about feasibility, about loyalty. But Jenna's words reverberated even among the doubtful. National media seized on her testimony. Hashtags surged, had echo the truth, had honor in action. The momentum she'd helped spark began to spread far beyond the confines of that room. At the base, she returned not to accolades, but to the rhythms of routine, leading drills, answering questions, listening. Veterans opened up during training sessions, recounting silent traumas and hard-won lessons. Young officers began to ask deeper questions, not just about tactics, but about ethics. Slowly, the air changed. The program was no longer seen as a liability, but as a lifeline. But the backlash came, sharp, coordinated, impersonal. Political actors with ties to the old system launched smear campaigns. Disinformation trickled into the press. Jenna received anonymous threats, whispers of scandal, bureaucratic roadblocks designed to stall her reforms. It would have been easy to withdraw, to let exhaustion win, but she didn't. Instead, she invited scrutiny, held open forums, brought in independent auditors, sat for interviews. Her commitment to honesty became its own shield, forging unlikely alliances with lawmakers across the aisle, with advocacy networks, with media willing to tell the story whole. She didn't just respond, she outpaced the resistance with grace and precision. New recruits came in waves, many drawn by her story. They trained harder, questioned deeper, and began to wear the red echo emblem with quiet pride. They weren't just training for war, they were training for responsibility. One evening, Jenna found a letter tucked into her locker. A young soldier who had passed the Red Echo simulation wrote with humble gratitude, describing how the training had not only sharpened his skill, but transformed his sense of duty. He wrote of courage, of conscience. She read it twice. Her eyes stung, but her hands never trembled. The mission had grown beyond her. This was no longer her war alone. It was a movement, living and breathing through every soldier who chose truth over silence. Months later, she stood beneath the high ceilings of the base's new training hall, now named the Rhodes Center for Tactical Integrity and Veteran Advocacy. The dedication ceremony was both formal and raw. Families of veterans, commanding officers, political officials, and rank-and-file soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder. A plaque bearing her name shone on the wall, not in tribute to a hero, but as a symbol of what could be done when someone refused to give up. Colonel Avery Mason, once a haunted skeptic and now an ally, addressed the crowd. His voice cracked as he said, "She reminded us all that courage doesn't end in the field. It begins again when you challenge the rot within." Jenna listened quietly, the moment heavy with memory. She hadn't sought praise. All she ever wanted was a military culture that matched the dignity of the people inside it. As she stepped forward to accept the honor, her fingers brushed the faint ridges of her tattoo. It no longer hurt, it pulsed. A signal to those who still dared to care. There was still so much work to do. Systems cling to power, change grates against the gears of comfort, but the flame Jenna lit had grown into something that could not be hidden. Not anymore. Her final words at the podium were almost a whisper, but they reached every corner of the hall. Real strength lives in our integrity. It's the courage to face what's broken and the will to protect those who carry our future. Thunderous applause followed. Outside, soldiers and civilians clustered in small groups, sharing their own stories, their own scars. Some talked of hope for the first time in years. That night, Jenna walked alone along the same runway she'd stood on before. Above her, the stars flickered to life. In those distant lights, she saw not just memories, but possibilities. Red Echo was no longer hers. It belonged to everyone who chose to carry the burden of truth forward. Her tattoo tingled softly, flesh and spirit aligned. The fight for honor, for clarity, for justice was far from over. But it was no longer a lonely battle. The future shimmered in the distance, uncertain but alive. Jenna Rhodess stood at the edge of that airfield once more, surrounded by the quiet hum of new recruits training under protocols she had helped forge. The battles of the past had become the foundation for something stronger, something enduring. The Red Echo protocols were no longer a secret. They were a pledge, an oath etched into the bones of the institution. Veterans who had once come home to silence now found support. Young soldiers weren't just taught to fight, they were taught to think, to lead with conscience. The tattoo on Jenna's side had become a symbol recognized across ranks, across branches. It didn't belong to a single woman anymore. It belonged to the movement she sparked. The story of Red Echo was now told in classrooms, in training camps, and over kitchen tables. Veterans spoke openly, healing together, bridging old wounds with shared truth. Jenna, staring toward the horizon, felt both the immense weight of what still lay ahead and the quiet joy of what had already begun. The mission was no longer hers alone. It had become a collective vow to listen, to act, to never forget the cost of silence. The foundation was laid, and though storms might come, the pillars would hold. The legacy of those who had suffered in shadows now lived in the light. And beneath that vast, starlit sky, Jenna Rhodess walked on, etched with memory, guided by purpose, and steadied by a legacy too powerful to ever fade. Jenna drew in a long breath as the evening settled in, her gaze steady, her posture resolute, not just a soldier molded by years of discipline, nor merely a leader forged in secrecy and shadows, but a guardian of something far greater, a future rooted in integrity, forged by strength and sustained by the quiet fire of an unwavering spirit. The battle wasn't behind her. It was all around her, evolving, still unfolding. Outside, the base lay wrapped in dusk, the hum of machinery a low rhythm beneath the whispering wind weaving through the trees. Jenna Rhodess stood quietly at the window of her small quarters, eyes fixed on the runway stretching into the horizon. It was the same stretch of concrete that had launched so many lives into peril, purpose, and the unknown. It had carried stories both triumphant and tragic, and it would carry more. She knew that. The ink beneath her skin, etched along her ribs in a language only a few truly understood, remained a quiet echo of what she had endured, what she had survived. The Red Echo 9. Not just a code, not just a memory. It was a reminder that the deepest wars weren't fought with bullets, but with conviction. Real change, she had come to learn, didn't happen in sweeping declarations or press releases. It happened in persistence, in quiet defiance. In holding the line day after day, her path from an overlooked instructor burdened by ghosts of a covert past to a reformist who stood before the National Task Force had not been linear. It had been riddled with opposition, scars both seen and hidden, and moments that tested the very core of her beliefs. But it was that same journey that proved the power of standing in the light, even when others tried to force her back into the shadows. In the days after her testimony, Jenna witnessed the first ripples of change take hold, not just within the armed forces, but beyond their walls. Veterans who had long remained silent began to share their truths on new platforms built with dignity. Training centers across the country began revising their simulations to reflect the principles of Red Echo: transparency, accountability, and psychological resilience. And for the first time in years, policy discussions began centering on the human being behind the uniform, not just the data. Still, Jenna knew better than to claim victory. Reform was never a final chapter. It was a daily act of resistance. Every day brought new trials. Every system had its inertia, and every truth spoken came at a cost. As she moved to prepare for rest, her thoughts shifted to the young soldiers she trained, many of whom carried wounds that hadn't yet found words. Some had passed through simulations broken by flaws she had fought to expose. Others carried burdens so private they could never be simulated. These quiet sacrifices kept her grounded, fueled the fire inside her to keep fighting for them. She reached for her phone. A new message blinked onto the screen. A recruit she had once mentored, barely 18 then, trembling and unsure, had written simply, "Thank you for showing me what strength really looks like." Jenna's breath caught for a moment, then came the softest smile. Not relief, not pride, something deeper. A quiet acknowledgement that even in the chaos, something lasting had been built. Far beyond the base, across towns and cities, homes and headquarters, people had followed her story. They had listened to the woman with the quiet voice and the tattooed ribs who didn't just survive betrayal. She stared it down and reclaimed what it tried to steal. To them, Jenna wasn't just a soldier or a whistleblower. She had become something more, a symbol of moral courage, of leadership grounded in pain and clarity, of what it means to rebuild trust in a broken system. In hushed conversations and online forums, in mess halls and living rooms, her story stirred something. And though Jenna would never seek recognition, those watching saw her. They saw her unwavering fight, her unspoken scars, her refusal to let silence bury the truth. For Jenna, the mission was never about fame. It was about truth, about those who came after, about the ones who never got the chance to speak. And so the night deepened, quiet, steady, and Jenna Rhodess stood not just as someone who had endured, but as someone who chose again and again to face forward. The road ahead remained long, but tonight there was peace. Not because the war was won, but because something unbreakable had taken root. A purpose built on memory, pain, and the kind of strength that doesn't need a uniform to be seen.